A couple, Kid Rock or somebody, anyway. And somebody, Katie Couric, something.
Chris Rock's voice was never soft. From the moment he stepped on stage, his comedy sounded sharp, loud, almost confrontational. People assumed it was confidence, like he enjoyed pushing buttons just to watch people squirm. But that wasn't what was really happening. That edge came from fear, from learning early that if you didn't control the room would control you. Humor wasn't his personality, it was his shield. Every joke was a way to stay ahead of the threat. Make them laugh before they decide to hurt you. Say the uncomfortable thing first so no one else can weaponize it. That instinct followed him everywhere, even when he became famous, even when the money came, even when the applause never stopped. Because applause doesn't erase memory, and it doesn't rewrite childhood. Behind the success, there was always a sense that the ground could disappear at any moment. That safety was temporary. That belonging could be revoked. So Chris never relaxed into fame. He attacked it. Loud jokes, hard truths, no pauses, no softness. But that instinct didn't come from Hollywood pressure or public scrutiny. It was built long before cameras ever pointed at him. And it started in classrooms where he was never supposed to feel safe. As a child in Brooklyn, Chris Rock was bussed into mostly white schools far from his neighborhood. Every morning meant leaving what little comfort he had and stepping into an environment where he stood out instantly. He was often the only black kid in the room, and that made him a target. The bullying wasn't occasional, it was constant. Slurs were thrown casually, shoves turned into beatings. Humiliation became routine. Teachers rarely intervened. Sometimes they didn't even look up. Chris learned early that no one was coming to protect him. By the time other kids were worrying about grades or sports, he was focused on survival, reading the room, watching hands, anticipating danger. Every hallway felt like a test he could fail at any moment. That kind of stress doesn't disappear when the bell rings. It embeds itself. It teaches your body to stay tense even when nothing is happening. Chris later said those years felt like living inside a tunnel with no exit. Just endurance, day after day. And while most people assume that kind of bullying fades with time, for Chris, it followed him home. Quietly, invisibly, because the damage didn't stop at words or fists. The bullying crossed lines that no kid should ever have to process. Chris later described parts of what he endured as rapish, choosing a word that hinted at violation without laying everything bare. It wasn't just physical pain. It was humiliation, powerlessness, being made to feel small in ways that stay with you forever. That experience shaped how he saw himself. He grew up believing that comfort was something other people deserved, that safety wasn't meant for him, that love always came with conditions. Even as an adult, those beliefs lingered. Success didn't erase them. It complicated them. Because when the world tells you you've made it, but your nervous system still feels under threat, something doesn't add up. Chris carried that disconnect for decades. He questioned why rooms felt uncomfortable, why relationships felt confusing, why moments that should have felt joyful never fully landed. He blamed himself, thought he was broken, thought he just needed to work harder, be sharper, be louder. It wasn't until much later that he finally got an answer, and it explained more than he ever expected. At 55 years old, Chris Rock was diagnosed with a non-verbal learning disorder. It affects how someone processes social cues, facial expressions, and emotional tone. Suddenly, his entire life made sense. The awkward pauses, the misread moments, the feeling of being slightly out of sync even among friends. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't coldness. His brain simply processed the world differently. The diagnosis hit hard, not because it was bad news, but because it came so late. Decades of confusion suddenly had a name. Decades of self-blame finally had context. Chris began spending up to 7 hours a week in therapy, unpacking trauma layered on top of a brain wired for misunderstanding. Fame hadn't fixed it. Money hadn't softened it. Success had only masked it. And that realization was sobering. Because long before therapy, long before diagnoses, he had already built his own solution. A place where social cues didn't matter, where control belonged to him. A stage. Around the age of 12, Chris Rock entered a local talent show. He didn't expect much. He just wanted an escape. He performed an impression, half hoping no one would notice. But they did. The crowd laughed. Loudly. That reaction changed something inside him. For once, the attention didn't feel dangerous. It felt empowering. He wasn't being laughed at. He was being listened to. He even won $20. But the money didn't matter. The feeling did. On stage, rules were different. Timing mattered more than looks. Words mattered more than status. If he controlled the rhythm, he controlled the room. That realization stuck. Humor became his way out, his armor, his weapon, his identity. Even as the bullying continued, even as life stayed hard, he now had something no one could take away. And from that moment on, Chris Rock chased that feeling everywhere. But turning laughter into a future would demand more sacrifice than he ever imagined. By his late teens, Chris Rock wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing stage time. Every night meant another cramped comedy club, another sticky floor, another microphone that barely worked. The pay was almost insulting. Sometimes $50, sometimes nothing at all. Most nights, he didn't even have a place to go home to. He slept on friends' couches, borrowed jackets in the winter, and ate whatever was cheap enough to survive on. But none of that stopped him, because the stage was the only place where the chaos in his head lined up. When he spoke into a mic, the world made sense for a few minutes. The laughter told him he existed, that he mattered. New York comedy in the early 80s wasn't gentle. You bombed loudly or you didn't get invited back. Chris bombed plenty, but he learned fast. He sharpened his timing. He studied crowds. He learned when to attack and when to pause. Every night was a test, and failure was common. But quitting never felt like an option. Because then, one night, someone important walked through the door. When Eddie Murphy showed up at the club, the room shifted instantly. Eddie was already a phenomenon. Movies, money, power. And when he saw Chris Rock perform, he didn't see polish. He saw hunger. He saw pain shaped into rhythm. Eddie didn't rewrite Chris's material. He didn't tell him to soften his edge. He simply opened doors that were normally sealed shut. In an industry that rarely made space for young black comics, that quiet support mattered more than any speech ever could. Suddenly, Chris was being seen by the right people, getting real opportunities. Not because he fit a mold, but because he broke one. But mentorship didn't mean protection. Hollywood doesn't care about potential. It cares about results. And Chris was about to learn that being noticed doesn't mean being respected. Chris started landing small roles in films and TV, quick appearances. Minor characters, names audiences barely remembered, a valet, a hustler, a guy in the background. It was exposure, but not stability. Each role came with long hours and little recognition. He watched others move up faster, watched doors open for people who looked more comfortable on camera. He learned the hierarchy fast. Being funny wasn't enough. Being famous wasn't enough. Still, he showed up. Memorized lines, watched directors closely, studied how actors carried themselves. These years weren't glamorous, but they were educational. Chris wasn't building fame. He was building survival skills. And then came the opportunity everyone dreams about. A seat at the biggest table in comedy. Joining Saturday Night Live should have been the breakthrough. Instead, it became a slow-motion collapse. Chris struggled to find his footing. His sketches didn't land. Characters fell flat. Critics noticed. Audiences noticed. Behind the scenes, the pressure was relentless. The writing room was brutal. Confidence drained fast. Week after week, he felt like he didn't belong. The same feeling from school hallways came rushing back. Soon, the label stuck. The least popular cast member. A quiet failure in front of millions. Chris internalized it. Thought maybe the bullies were right all along. And when he tried to explore other opportunities, things got even worse. When producers discovered Chris was considering another show, The response was swift. He was fired. No long conversation, no safety net, just gone. The humiliation hit hard. He felt exposed, rejected, publicly labeled as someone who couldn't cut it. It reopened old wounds he thought he'd escaped. But losing SNL forced him to make a choice: chase approval again, or build something on his own terms. That anger didn't fade, it sharpened. And instead of breaking him, it pushed him toward the moment that would finally change everything. Getting fired didn't just hurt Chris Rock's career. It lit something inside him. For the first time, he stopped trying to fit into rooms that never wanted him comfortable. Instead, he leaned into the anger, the confusion, the resentment. He poured it all into his writing. That's where CB4 came from. Not as a calculated career move, but as a release. A way to mock power instead of chasing it. The movie wasn't polished. It wasn't safe. But it was honest. Chris wasn't asking for permission anymore. He was daring the industry to keep up. And audiences felt that shift immediately. The edge was sharper. The jokes were riskier. The confidence felt earned instead of borrowed. This was the moment where Chris stopped surviving and started attacking comedy head-on. And if you're still watching, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Because what came next didn't just change his career, it changed stand-up forever. Here's the real question though. Do you think Chris Rock needed to fail publicly before he could become legendary? Because the next chapter didn't just prove people wrong, it shook the entire culture. When Bring the Pain aired on HBO, it didn't feel like a comedy special. It felt like an eruption. Filmed at the Apollo Theater, the room was electric before Chris even spoke. Every sentence landed harder than the last. He wasn't easing audiences in. He was daring them to stay. The jokes about race, power, and America weren't dressed up. They were blunt, uncomfortable, necessary. One line about O.J. Simpson split the country in half overnight. People quoted it everywhere. Barbershops, news panels, living rooms. Chris Rock wasn't just funny anymore. He was unavoidable. But the success came fast and loud. Too fast to process. Overnight fame magnified everything he already struggled with. Expectations exploded. Pressure doubled. Because when you change the game demands more from you. And Chris was about to learn that being influential comes with a heavy emotional price. As Chris's career exploded, he started noticing something unsettling. Comedy rewarded excess, pain, self-destruction. The more broken someone was, the more they were celebrated for pushing through it. He watched friends spiral. Chris Farley's decline hit especially hard. Farley gave everything to make people laugh. His body, his dignity, his health. And when Farley eventually OD'd, Chris wasn't shocked. He later said he saw death in Farley's eyes the last time they spoke. That realization stayed with him. Comedy didn't protect people, it consumed them. Chris started questioning the cost of staying sharp, staying relevant, staying dangerous. And that fear followed him home. Because while the audience saw success, Chris was quietly watching the people around him disappear. Tragedy didn't stop with friends. Chris's father died young after a lifetime of exhausting labor. 2 jobs. No shortcuts, just survival. The loss forced Chris to confront how fragile everything really was. Years later, his brother died homeless after decades battling addiction. The contrast was brutal. One brother famous, one brother forgotten. Same blood, completely different outcomes. Chris rarely spoke about it publicly. But the guilt lingered. Why him? Why success for one and suffering for another? That question haunted him. Because fame doesn't feel like a blessing when it highlights what others didn't survive. And instead of slowing down, Chris kept pushing harder, louder, sharper, because stopping meant feeling everything he'd been avoiding. With Bigger and Blacker, Chris turned the intensity up again. The jokes hit harder, the delivery was louder, the crowd reactions were explosive. On paper, it looked like total control. But behind the scenes, the pressure was suffocating. The expectation to stay fearless never stopped. Every new special had to go further, say more, risk more. Chris wasn't just performing anymore. He was carrying a cultural role, a voice people expected to challenge everything. And while audiences loved it, the pace was unsustainable. Because when your entire identity is built on being sharp, there's no room to be tired, no room to heal. And that tension would eventually push Chris Rock into an entirely different kind of spotlight. When Chris Rock crossed fully into Hollywood films, the numbers exploded. Bigger checks, bigger audiences, bigger expectations. Movies like Madagascar turned his voice into something children recognized instantly. Suddenly, he wasn't just a stand-up comic, he was everywhere. Commercials, blockbusters, red carpets. From the outside, it looked like total victory. But fame didn't bring comfort, it brought distance. Chris began to feel disconnected from the raw honesty that built his career. The more mainstream he became, the more he felt like he was playing a version of himself instead of being himself. Laughter still came easily. Peace didn't. The public image kept growing while the private confusion deepened. And behind the success, something personal was quietly cracking. Because the pressure didn't stop at work, it followed him home. Chris Rock was married for nearly 2 decades. From the outside, it looked stable, private, protected. But fame doesn't pause when you step off stage. It leaks into everything. Chris later admitted to cheating, admitted to addiction, admitted to losing control of parts of his life he never thought he would. The divorce that followed wasn't just emotional. It was public, painful, and humiliating in ways money couldn't soften. Custody battles, sealed details, and constant scrutiny pushed him into a deep reset. For the first time, he wasn't hiding behind jokes. There was nothing to perform. And while he was dealing with the collapse of his marriage, another weight was pressing down on him. One that reminded him how fragile life really is. During the darkest period of his divorce, Chris was also caring for his mother as she battled cancer. Hospital visits, long nights, fear he didn't know how to say out loud. The emotional whiplash was brutal. One moment meeting with lawyers, the next sitting beside his mother, praying she would survive. He later said the street where her hospital was located felt cursed because it held both his greatest fear and his greatest failure at the same time. She survived, but the emotional weight stayed. Chris was smiling for cameras while quietly preparing for loss. And that kind of strain doesn't disappear. It builds. And then, on the world's biggest stage, everything snapped into focus. When Chris Rock walked onto the Oscars stage, he was already carrying years of unresolved trauma. The pressure of hosting, the weight of representation, the expectations from every side. Then it happened. 8 seconds. A moment so shocking it froze the room. Chris didn't react the way people expected. He didn't explode. He didn't swing back. He stood there, processing, surviving. That wasn't weakness. That was instinct. The same instinct built in childhood hallways. But the world didn't see it that way. And what followed hurt more than the moment itself. The internet took over instantly. Clips, memes, think pieces. Everyone decided who Chris Rock was supposed to be in that moment. Silence became misread as defeat. Trauma became entertainment. Chris disappeared publicly. No interviews, no statements, just distance. Therapy intensified. Reflection deepened. He knew reacting too fast would only feed the noise, so he waited. Because when Chris Rock finally spoke, he wasn't going to do it emotionally. He was going to do it deliberately. And that decision would reshape how the entire world saw the moment. Chris Rock didn't respond right away after the Oscars moment, and that silence confused people. Some thought he was scared. Others thought he was broken. But the truth was simpler and far more deliberate. Chris was watching, listening, letting the noise burn itself out. Because reacting immediately would have handed control to everyone else. When he finally spoke, he didn't scream or lash out. He explained something deeper: selective outrage. The idea that society doesn't react to events based on principle, but convenience. Certain people get endless grace. Others get turned into lessons. Chris pointed out how outrage is often less about morality and more about power, timing, and public sympathy. By waiting, he forced the world to sit with its own hypocrisy. He let the moment age, let people argue themselves into exhaustion. And when he finally addressed it, the words landed heavier because the emotion had cooled. This wasn't avoidance, it was strategy. And that restraint revealed something unexpected. Chris Rock wasn't just responding to one incident. He was talking about a lifetime of being misunderstood. One of the most unsettling things Chris Rock ever admitted was that success didn't heal him. Not even a little. Fame didn't quiet the noise in his head. Money didn't bring peace. Awards didn't erase childhood fear. He explained that trauma doesn't disappear when life improves. It waits, it hides, and it often shows up later when you finally stop running. Chris revealed he spends hours every week in therapy, unpacking layers of pain built over decades. Bullying, abuse, confusion. A brain wired differently in a world that never slowed down. For years, he thought something was wrong with him. Why joy felt muted, why relationships felt strained, why being admired still felt unsafe. The diagnosis gave him clarity, but it also brought grief for the time he lost blaming himself. This wasn't a confession for sympathy, it was context, because suddenly, the sharpness of his comedy didn't feel cruel. It felt protective, and that realization changed how people heard his voice. When Chris Rock returned to touring, longtime fans noticed something different immediately. The urgency was gone. He wasn't attacking the room anymore. He was inviting it in. The jokes still hit, but there was space between them. Pauses that mattered, silence that felt intentional. He wasn't trying to dominate attention or chase viral moments. He didn't need to prove he was still relevant. He already knew who he was. Instead of recycling old material, he evolved it. Mixed humor with reflection, anger with clarity. Audiences didn't just laugh, they listened. Tickets sold out not because of controversy, but trust. People came knowing they'd get honesty instead of spectacle. For the first time in decades, Chris Rock wasn't performing survival. He was performing truth. And that shift made his presence more powerful than ever before. At a certain point, Chris Rock stopped explaining himself. Not because he didn't care, but because he finally understood that constant explanation is a trap. For most of his life, he felt pressured to justify his tone, his anger, his humor, and even his silence. Every controversy came with an expectation that he would clarify, apologize, or soften. And for a long time, he played along. But something shifted. Therapy didn't just help him unpack trauma. It helped him recognize patterns. One of them was the need for validation, the constant proving, the endless chase to be understood by people who had already made up their minds. Chris realized that staying visible all the time came at a cost. The more available he was, the less grounded he felt. So he pulled back. Not dramatically, quietly. He became more selective about projects, more intentional about where his energy went. Instead of chasing headlines, he focused on creating work that actually mattered to him, producing, directing, supporting voices that reminded him of his younger self, raw, misunderstood, and hungry to be heard. This wasn't retreat, it was control. Chris Rock didn't need to dominate every conversation anymore. He had already said what he needed to say, and for the first time, he wasn't measuring success by applause or attention. He was measuring it by peace. That choice didn't make him disappear. It made him lighter. Because when you stop running from who you are, you finally get to decide where you're going. Chris Rock didn't become one of the most influential comedians of his generation because life treated him gently. He became who he is because it didn't. Comedy was never just a talent for him. It was a survival tool, a way to control chaos, a way to stay one step ahead of pain. Every punchline carried history. Years of bullying, years of misunderstanding, years of feeling unsafe in rooms where everyone else seemed comfortable. The laughter people heard was real, but so was the armor behind it. For a long time, comedy protected him from feeling everything at once. It gave him distance, structure, control. But protection isn't healing, and eventually, even the strongest shields get heavy. What makes Chris Rock's story different isn't just success. It's awareness. He didn't stay trapped in the version of himself that only survived. He grew into someone willing to examine the cost of that survival. To admit that being strong all the time isn't the same as being healthy. And maybe that's the part we miss. The people who make us laugh the hardest aren't immune to pain. They've just learned how to translate it. So the next time Chris Rock steps on stage, remember this. You're not just hearing jokes crafted for applause. You're hearing decades of resilience turned into rhythm.